in the survey and other writings and talks, you explicitly espouse the Tibetan Triyana perspective, that the three yanas are successive stages in spiritual life, the latter corresponding to higher stages than the earlier. This would seem inconsistent with your later teaching. How do you now view the three yanas? Presumably not everybody is completely clear about this, or are they? Tibetan Buddhism is often described as Triyana Buddhism. I remember Dharma Rinpoche used to make this point, that Tibetan Buddhism is not Mahayana Buddhism, it's Triyana Buddhism. It's a synthesis of the Hinayana, Mahayana and Vajrayana. I'm going to have to be very brief here, but broadly speaking, the Tibetans see the three yanas as successive. They see the Hinayana as leading on to the Mahayana. They see the Hinayana as quite basic and elementary, the Mahayana as much more advanced, and the Vajrayana as more advanced still. Yeah. So, as Subhuti, it is Subhuti's question, as Subhuti does state, when I was in Kalimpong, I more or less followed that Tibetan understanding of their Buddhism, or even of Indian Buddhism as such, that it had gone through these three phases, and each one representing, well, the succeeding phase representing an advance on the succeeding stage. But over the years, I came to disagree with that view. And the reason was this. In Tibetan teaching, the Hinayana is equated with going for refuge. Going for refuge is something that you do within the Hinayana. When you pass on to the Mahayana, apparently you transcend the going for refuge. You leave that behind. You go on to a higher stage. You develop the bodhicitta. When you go on to the Vajrayana, well, you're given Abhisheka. That's a higher level or stage still. Though, in a way, the Vajrayana is included in the Mahayana at the same time. Need not go into that. So what I felt was this, that what I gradually came to realize was that if one sees going for refuge as the central and definitive act of the Buddhist spiritual life, you can't think in terms of going beyond that. So you can't really think of the bodhicitta, and therefore the Mahayana, as going beyond going for refuge and going beyond the Hinayana so-called. So I then started to see that the arising of the bodhicitta was in fact nothing less than the exploration of the more altruistic dimension of the going for refuge itself. Yeah? The Vajrayana doesn't really come into it, being as it were included from this point of view, especially in the Mahayana. Yeah. So is that clear? Yeah. I came across a very interesting little passage in, and I think it was a talk by Philip Kapleau, where he says that in Soto Zen they've forgotten about the going for refuge, but it is there in Dogen's teaching. And he quotes an interesting passage that I'm probably going to use in my book launch talk, in San Francisco. Yeah. And apparently Dogen, as he was dying, inscribed Buddha, Dharma, Sangha on a pillar, and was constantly circumambulating that pillar. Yeah? And there are other references that Philip Kapleau quotes, and Philip Kapleau makes the point that, well, in Zen we've been so preoccupied with sitting and other practices that we've forgotten and neglected even more basic things. Yeah? So I thought that a very valuable admission on his part, and something that we can certainly link up with.
How would this fit in with the White Lotus Sutra, where the Buddha is presented as making this Buddha teaching.
Yes, well, here one has to see the whole historical background, because in ancient India they didn't have the idea of historical development. Yeah, by the time that the White Lotus Sutra emerged, the original teaching of the Buddha, as one may call it, had shrunk somewhat in the hands of some people, and arahantship had become a rather individualistic sort of goal. So those who wanted to correct that sort of development didn't have the historical sense, as it were, to be able to say, well, look, this is not what the Buddha actually taught historically. They sort of constructed this myth, and they posited, the further teaching of the one yana instead of the three. Yeah? Perhaps I should, it's a very complex question, but elaborating on it just very briefly. It would seem that during the Buddha's lifetime, the goal of the disciple was the same as the goal of the Buddha himself. There was only Buddhahood. Yeah? The Arahant was a Buddha, just as the Buddha was a Buddha. The Arahant was sometimes called Anu-Buddha, or after Buddha, the one who was enlightened by following in the footsteps of the Buddha. But it seems in the course of centuries, the idea developed that the Buddha was much more developed than the Arahants, and the Arahants were less developed. And then there was an intermediate stage of the Pratyeka Buddha. So you had three paths. You could either decide to be an Arahant or a Pratyeka Buddha, or you could decide, to be a Buddha, and therefore a Bodhisattva. So the whoever it was composed and presented the White Lotus Sutra didn't understand that there had been that sort of historical development. At the same time, didn't feel happy that there were these three different paths and these lower goals for certain people. Therefore, created that sort of myth to explain the matter, and presented the Buddha as teaching this, as it were, further teaching that all the yanas coalesced into one yana, and that in reality there was really, in the end, only one yana for all. So it's a rather roundabout sort of process. We don't need to do that, because we can understand that, well, yes, there was a historical development within Buddhism, there was a degeneration which had to be corrected, and that correction we find to some extent in the White Lotus Sutra, but we find it in this sort of mythic form. This needs to be spelled out, much more in detail, but I hope it's reasonably clear. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I discussed this somewhere. I discussed it a bit before I became aware of that discussion in China. And what I said, I'm not sure if I said it in Eternal Legacy or in the survey, but what I said was that the Bodhisattva yana that is distinguished, from the Shravaka yana and the Pratyeka Buddha yana, that yana is not to be identified with the Eka yana. So this would seem to have been the ultimate Chinese position, or at least the position of some Chinese Buddhists. Yeah. Well, clearly there are sort of deeper and deeper levels of the spiritual path, but I think the main point is that we can't really equate them with the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana in the traditional Tibetan sense, even though we may, draw, as it were, more what seem to be more advanced teachings or teachings relating to deeper experiences from this yana rather than that. Yeah. Because you get visualization even in the Theravada. Yeah? You certainly get it in the Mahayana. In the Pali Canon there are instances of disciples visualizing the Buddha, or the Buddha appearing before them in a radiant form. Yeah. I think we have to be very careful, because I did see a reference to a talk by Vasantara where he had said that, well, the Hinayana appeals to the head, the Mahayana to the heart, and the Vajrayana to the guts. Yeah. So I think taken out of context, that could be very misleading. Yeah? Because the Hinayana certainly doesn't just appeal to the head, nor the Mahayana, just to the heart, and so on. Yeah? So I think we have to be very careful when we are sort of trying to express our own distinctive understanding of the Dharma, but drawing on traditional, as it were, Triyana material. Yeah? I have said somewhere that, well, maybe we should use the terms Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana just as representing certain attitudes of individuals. But then you've got to make it clear that, well, that's quite different from the historical yanas.
I wonder it's really useful to do that
Yes.
because of the...
Because I've made the point that I've met, say, bhikkhus who are technically Hinayanists, but spending their whole lives in propagating the Dharma, just as though they were bodhisattvas. And I've met Tibetan Buddhist monks who didn't care at all about propagating the Dharma, technically they were following Triyana, but their attitude was as it were Hinayanistic. But there's a lot of sorting out that we have to do in this area. Things still aren't clear, and it isn't going to be easy just because of the nature of the historical development of Buddhism.